Welcome to the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar, Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University, and I'm joined by Professor Richard Wolff. Hey guys, it's Shahram with another episode of the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding the interdisciplinary and revolutionary world of Marxian theory. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing the idea that Marxism can be developed as a critique of TINA. For those of you who don't know, TINA is an acronym that refers to the unimaginative, defeatist idea that there is no alternative, and hence, in one shape or the other, we must vote for the lesser of the two evils. For those of you who haven't had a chance to already look at our last episode, Marxism and the Crisis of Democracy, Professor Rick Wolff said something really interesting and fascinating in that video. He said that to deal with the crisis of everything, or the polycrisis as it is called in fashionable academic circles, we have to rethink and reimagine possibilities. And the set of possibilities that he says he has used and relied upon emanate directly from his training in Marxism and Marxist theory. So I thought that it would be really interesting for us to devote this particular episode and the next one to rethinking our political ideas and our political practice. And by virtue of doing that, in the pursuit of that, we're going to be looking at multiple countries: France, Germany, obviously the United States, and Great Britain. And also, if we get the chance, to look at some countries in the global south, such as Bangladesh, which has had some really interesting developments in recent weeks and months. All right, guys, let's welcome none other than Professor Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He's recently published a very interesting book called Understanding Capitalism. Everyone should check it out if you really want to understand capitalism, and what he means by it is by no means identical to what other people, even those who call themselves Marxists, may not necessarily have the same vision. All right, guys, let's welcome Professor Wolff. Hey, Rick, how are you? I hope you had a
Okay, Shahram, glad to be here.
I hope you had a relaxing summer.
So far, yes.
Well, that's unlike the situation that we're facing at the political front. It seems that in the United States, at least, um, when I came to the US, I learned this metaphor, which I detest intensely. And as an outsider, perhaps, uh, there's this idea that many of my friends on the left have tried to convince me of, which is holding your nose and voting. Is that an American thing, or do you find evidence, because you have linkages with France and Germany, as we discovered in episode one? Uh, are we the only political entity on the world map that has this particular way of thinking about the world, or is it a crisis of imagination everywhere?
It's in many, many places. In no way is that unique to the United States. It's like the old notion of the lesser of two evils. It has ancient provenance in many, many parts of the world. I would be surprised if it didn't exist almost everywhere, with slight local variations because of language and history. But it is a kind of lament, if you like, when people are confronted with a political situation in which what they want, what they would support, is not among the available choices. You know, it's particularly in Western liberal capitalism that you find it, because it has an ideology that stresses, quote unquote, freedom of choice as being some kind of crucial component to everything that's important in life. And so they have to give you choice when, in fact, the system is set up in such a hierarchical way that those at the top, those who have the wealth and the power concentrated in their hands, are terrified of real choice. So they have to give you choice without giving you choice. And if that sounds contradictory, which we're going to be talking about, well, then good. That's what it is. It's contradictory. And the resolution to that contradiction is to give you a choice that isn't a choice. And for example, we have that here in the United States. We have the Republicans and the Democrats about to give us a choice early in November to choose between them. Now, there are differences between them and important ones. But when it comes to basic economics, no, there's no significant difference between them, and not even much difference that's insignificant. There's just not much difference, but we have a choice. We have two parties, and so you get the phrase, you hold your nose because there isn't a real choice, and you choose between the unreal, the limited, the fake, the constricted choice that is what they offer you. But if you're honest and if you understand, then you hold your nose, you make your choice, but you spend most of your time explaining why that choice is something people should be fighting against, precisely because it isn't a real one. It doesn't encompass what all the options on the table ought to be.
So I want to, before we dive into France, Germany, the United States, and all the rest of it, I just wanted to spend some time with you because you've spent your entire life thinking about this particular problem. And this is going to be useful both for people, my age, as well as people in Gen Z, etc. This idea that certain political choices, for example, the abolition of wage labor and the introduction of workers' cooperatives around the world, or even something as insane as what I would love, the abolition of countries. Why is it that despite the fact that some things may seem perfectly obvious to us and we could also rationalize them, and conceptually we could convince people that, well, if we do this, this is going to be a great idea. For example, I'm thinking of um, if we were having this conversation in 1845 and there was a conservative economist and there was a liberal economist and then there was someone like you, an abolitionist, right? And other people would be saying that, well, what you're suggesting is not within the window that we can imagine, right? Do you think that, you know there was this guy called John Overton who came up with the idea of the Overton window, that basically the choices, the imaginations are restricted by some abstract notion. Before we go into France, Germany, and the relative, performance of the left, etc., and the right in those countries, and how you see those as a Marxist analyst, I just wanted to understand this struggle because this is something that I find deeply frustrating. I can convince someone that surplus value is the basis of capitalism, but then they're going to say, well, this is impossible. So the same thing could have been said for, people who were defending or, talking about reform of slavery in 1845. How have you dealt with this frustration? And am I right in feeling frustrated at this particular way of thinking about the world, restricting it to, the Tina idea? There is no alternative.
Yes, I mean, I think that this is, again, not a new phenomena and no way particular to the United States. I think that every system, as far back as I have ever had the chance to look, every system protects itself, or that the people who sit at the top of the system, to be more careful in my formulation, those who benefit from slavery, the master class, those who benefit from feudalism, the class of feudal lords, those who benefit from capitalism, the employer class. Those, to take those three paradigmatic classes, they are all characterized by a small group of people sitting at the top, the masters, the lords, the employers, and a vast mass of people over whom they exercise all kinds of relations like political power, surplus extraction, and so on, political, economic, and cultural dominance, and so forth. And they've all understood, the masters, the lords, and the employers, they've all understood this situation. They are very powerful. They are very rich. They're becoming more so, but they are forever threatened by the potential recognition of those over whom they exercise surplus extraction, cultural dominance, political power, that those from whom they take will resist, will figure it out, will demand change, will overthrow the system to get the change if it's not given to them when they ask for it. So they must protect themselves. And you know that they have a variety of ways of doing that. The Marxist theory of the state is basically a development of the idea that whatever other roles in earlier social systems the state may have had, once you have the class division of master slave, lord, serf, employer, employee, the state will be manipulated, maneuvered into becoming an apparatus to reproduce the existing system. It'll be brought into the service of the dominant class. Likewise, the cultural institutions and forms, churches, religions, whatever they may have been in earlier different systems, will be evolved, transformed, changed to become serviceable to capitalism. The great sociologist Max Weber, or the great British recorder of this, R.H. Tawney, if you've never read the work Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, the Tawney book is magnificent, a British work of the highest quality, documenting how Christianity, inherited when feudalism becomes capitalism in Europe, is transformed from being a pro feudal institution to being developed into a pro capitalist institution. In other words, the system protects itself. Now we get to your point. One of the ideas, one of the ideological adjustments every system works is to make the claim, using whatever inherited ideological or cultural forms it finds, using them to develop the idea that this is the highest point in history, whatever one we're at. It's more developed than everything that went before. To use modern language of the sort you'll find in a university, there'll be an argument made, which, by the way, is logically empty, but an argument very, very powerful. Capitalism is more efficient than any other system. The idea being everything else was a crude approximation until we reached perfection, until we reached the most efficient, carrying the implication that there's no point in looking at other systems. We've come to the Holy Grail. We have found the ultimate. Every one of those earlier ultimates turned out not to be the ultimate, but that has not prevented each class structure, capitalism, slavery, feudalism, whatever else, from imagining that it is the highest form. Fukuyama can talk about the end of history. They actually imagine that something that has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, is now going to stop. That whatever the current situation is, either there is nothing better than it, there is no alternative, or even worse. And I wish now I had some macabre music to play. The alternative represents regression. In other words, we are at the best there is. Don't even waste my time with an alternative because there isn't any, or it's regressive. It's going backwards in history. It will recreate feudalism. The confusion anti-socialists and anti-leftists often betray when they want to mingle together concepts like fascism and socialism, and they don't want to see change as some sort of development. You get this kind of notion that we are at the end, we are at the highest form. It's just, to be crude and simple, it's a way of stifling the imagination, cutting off the impulse human beings have always had. Always.
Yeah. Yeah.
Things could be other, things could be different from what they are. In the Marxian tradition, you're supposed to protect against the temptations of such an idea. And by temptation, I simply mean if you're surrounded by it and all the people you work with, your teachers, your students, your friends, your coworkers, think and talk like that, you're supposed to be protected by remembering, which is very valuable to do, Marx's inheritance from Hegel. Every system, if you're going to define it, if you're going to understand any system, it's the way you do that in your mind, the way your mind works, is to separate it from that which it is not. But that means that the boundary, which is what you're creating when you define something, that boundary has the other side. You are defining capitalism by what it is not. And in that act, you're defining what it is not, which is the other, so that you can never get away from it. It's a kind of torture of the mind, that the effort to get rid of the other is impossible. You're going to always discover it. It'll be provoked in your experience. It'll emerge in your dreams. It will slip out in the course of the conversation. It's rediscovered by Freud as the Freudian slip and all the repressed consciousness. But part of repressed consciousness is Hegel's understanding of the other. And so the notion that there is no alternative should, I think, for the kind of Marxist I am anyway, immediately sends up a warning flag. Anyone who ever tells you such a thing is a person you're going to find inadequate, because they don't understand contradiction, opposites, that what defining actually means. Hegel goes in his logic through a long, tedious, but very careful, elaborate presentation of all of this. And of course, since we don't study Hegel anymore, he being discarded along with everything else, that isn't convenient for capitalism. We don't have that in our culture. So part of your question forces us, which is why it's a good question, to reimagine and bring back into our thinking this notion of the other as always implicated in who we think we are. There is always an other. Human beings have always brought about change, otherwise, they wouldn't have had it. The change didn't come outside of the human experience. All technologies may have imagined they were the highest way of making steel, only to discover sooner or later, one place or another, an alternative way of making steel that had advantages, that was more efficient, or whatever magical term you invent to capture the idea that it could be other, it could be better, and we're going to get there.
Amazing. This kind of reminded me of this lovely book that you and Steve wrote many, many years ago. For those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it, it's called Contending Economic Theories, Marxian versus Neoclassical versus Keynesian. That's the new title. I have the older version, which I stole from Steve's office in Thompson Hall. But that's okay, because he taught me that property is theft. So I'm just going to use it. So you said something really interesting in this book, which kind of resonates with what you just said, that one of the problems with our political and economic imaginations has partially to do with the fact that, well, firstly, neoclassical or mainstream economics defines the object, right? Well, firstly, it's a selection problem. I mean, I don't know if you had a chance to look at that intriguing research that was recently published by NBER. It was on their Twitter page. Believe it or not, it studies whether people who are playing more video games are better looking than people who don't. If that's the kind of question that you're interested in, if that's what you're studying, obviously, I mean, firstly, your object is problematic, right? If I say that I'm interested in whether people bought that underwear or that toothpaste, and I say I'm interested in the equimarginal principle, as it is called, right? At the best, I mean, even if I become an expert at this, I'm going to learn something about shopping behavior at the end of this story. And then you're going to define the objects, and you're going to say, restrict the meaning of economics, right? So that someone who says, well, class exploitation is a question that economics should be studying. The Rana Plaza event in 2013, where 1,100 Bangladeshi workers lost their lives, is a question of economics, right? You're going to turn around and you're going to tell me that's not economics. Why? Well, because you defined it and then restricted its meaning, right? So
Yeah.
economics as a dismal science has a Tina problem in general. Would you
Yes.
agree with that?
Absolutely, and let me play with it for a moment with something you said. Property is theft. Actually, the proper origin of that is Proudhon, a French anarchist who had some interactions with Marx when Marx was still a relatively young man. He had a big reputation. Marx read his work, took some of it, was critical of other parts of it. But one part he was critical of was that notion, the phrase property is theft. But it was his Hegelian's education at work here. If you read Capital's first volume, as I know you have, and as I hope many of the people watching have, you'll know that Marx goes to a great deal of trouble in those early chapters explaining that what is unique about capitalism is that there is an equal exchange,
Mhm.
not a theft, an equal exchange between the employer and the employee. The employee sells labor power. The employer buys it. The wage, the name of what is paid is called the wage. The employer pays the wage, which is equal to the value of the labor power that the employee sells. It is an exchange of equals, as is the rule in capitalism when commodities exchange. So Marx then said, yes, but it's also an inequality. It's not an inequality or an equality. It is an inequality and an equality. That's the mystery. But it's the mystery in all things. And you understand something when you see in it the opposites. The genius of Marx was to say, in the equal exchange is an inequality, and you have to understand that, or you don't understand capitalism. You make the mistake of many of his contemporaries of think, and by the way, many people today who think that the exploitation is in the exchange. No, says Marx. The exchange is where the equal is, but buried underneath it or hidden by it is its own opposite, an inequality with it which is its condition of existence. You only have the equal exchange because of the inequality that it hides, and you only have the inequality by virtue of the equality hiding it. It is a crucial example, if you like, of the Marxian method, which is what we're talking about, being used in a very creative way. You can allow the worker to learn if you do this in a practical way. Yes, you are paid your wage. Yes, what you think you are paid what this is worth. You're paid amount of money which you use to buy the goods and et cetera, you live with. Yes, you are. You do have to be reproduced. Otherwise, this system is dead without you. You're crucial. But now the question is, why is the employer, who you know doesn't care about you at all, forced to give you this? Well, it turns out you can have this conversation. I've done it many times. It's not only to keep you alive so that you can keep coming back, so that you can raise a family to replace you when you die. That's crucial. That part you understand. But here's something you may not have understood. He keeps you going. He pays you because you give him more than he gives you. You are actually not just producing your own means of reproduction, you're producing the profit for him. And then it's a very small step to introduce the aha moment. Who needs him? You could produce the profit, the surplus, and you could be the one who gets it. You could, together with the other workers, appropriate that surplus and decide what to do it. And that would be a different way of organizing the economy. That, dear friend, is socialism. If you do that, and if you do it systematically, and if you do it continuously, then it won't be possible anymore for people to tell you that socialism is all about interesting programs the government might institute, like healthcare or free education, or a whole lot of good things you can support. But that's not the issue. That's why the examples of France and Europe, where the government does way more than it does in Britain and the United States, are not examples of socialism. They're examples of a preferable capitalism. Why? Because we still have the employer employee, which you've just finished explaining, is one of these contradictions, which, when you unravel it, teaches you something fundamental about the world you live in.
I could tell by some of the comments that we were getting that people are unaware of the fact that your particular understanding and interpretation of Marx and Marxism, and this cannot be emphasized enough. I mean, we keep saying it, but somehow in the minds of people, the word Marxism, socialism, communism, etc., these words, it's as if that Lacan talked about the battery of knowledge, right? That immediately, as soon as I say the word beautiful, for example, it evokes all kinds of other word strings in your mind, and it's as if your mind kind of refuses to understand that, well, people could be using the same word to mean different things. And this is something that you pointed out beautifully in this book as well, using even something as provocative as the idea of love. uh, and okay, so because I wanted to devote some time before we go into the present, huh? Because it's a challenge. uh, so you've done something with Marx's class analysis, right? Which I believe someone who only restricts his or her understanding or reading of Marx and Marxism to 1848, i.e., the Communist Manifesto, where there's this obviously it was a pamphlet, it was a political manifesto, as the name suggests. And this was, moreover, written by a man who was 30 years old, all the rest of it. Um, and obviously, there's a huge difference between Marx, the person we read in 1848, versus 1867. There's all kinds of differences here that you and Steve kind of struggled with, and you read Capital for class, right? You were looking, you were interested in what he said in the manifesto, the two class model. But because we're going to be looking at the real world next, France, Germany, US, and in the real world there's a multiplicity of classes, and there's all kinds of complex stuff taking place which emanates from your overdetermined analysis of class and class analysis. So just to make it absolutely sure once and for all. And I'm sure people are still gonna say blah, 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 it's all about state, the central planning and blah blah blah. I mean, can you just dumb it down for uh, someone like me, for example, um, who fails to understand that the word Marxism and socialism, as it is being deployed by Resnick and Wolf, uh, means something different. Firstly, because class means something else to you. It's not the division of the society in terms of the property relations or the means of production, or the division of society in income terms, etc. How did So can you explain that to us once and for all, so that people can understand why you don't think that the solution lies in the government doing everything, so that the plumber is going to be a bureaucrat? You know what I mean? uh, how is your Marxist theory, the one that you developed in Knowledge and Class, specifically on this particular question, different from other theorists who call themselves Marxists, etc.? Could you dumb it down for me?
I will try. Here we go. Every theorist, I believe, everyone, is confronted by the following problem if they are attracted to and are followers in some sense of a body of work. That's true whether they're right wing, left wing, middle, it doesn't really matter. In our case, to make a long story short, we found the Marxian tradition to be attractive for a whole lot of reasons. I don't want to go into them now, although I'm happy to if you want to at some time. I'm assuming that that's not necessary since the Marxian tradition has found people interested in it in every country on earth to this point. It's spread in the last 150 years since Marx died on a scale that very few groups of ideas ever have. You have to look to things like Islam or Christianity or a whole lot of other things to see anything like the spread of Marxism. It has been interesting to people in radically different economic, political, cultural, natural situations. So I was attracted. Now, every theorist, when that person is attracted, immediately will discover what we discovered, which is that we read at first, secondary, our teachers brought us to it. Older people, we were young, brought to us what they understood. And so after a while, we began to read the works of Marx and others who were considered, by random interactions we had, to be great spokespersons. So I read Marx and Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and a whole lot of other people I learned were important. I had the help of people in my family, literally my kinship structure, who knew some of this and gave me that encouragement, and then otherwise friends and teachers. And then I discovered this interesting thing, which every theorist does, that when you learn something enough to go read the original, which is why it is so important, you will discover very quickly that since that original was written 5 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, since that time, especially if the theory was revolutionary, critical of society, eager to go beyond the status quo, wanting change, that the development of that theory, the taking up of that theory by large numbers of people, all of which happened to Marxism in the 19th and 20th century, meant that it provoked reaction. It provoked all the people who didn't want Marxism, who think capitalism is the best thing since sliced bread, who want to preserve it. They were confronted with these ideas and they went to work against them. That happens to all theories on all sides. One of the things that is a result of that, here we go now, the crucial part, is that the ideas put forward by, say, Marx in this case, or by any revolutionary thinker. An easy parallel would be Freud for modern psychology. The terms Marx used, like the terms Freud used, were used by critics later and given different meanings. Sometimes this is done explicitly. They literally say Marx got this wrong, it's actually this. But much more important are the implicit. Even people who thought they were developing Marx's idea took it where they wanted to go. This included friends as well as enemies of Marxism. So by the time I get to read Marx, coming through all of the later people who filtered and developed it, I notice, as many have, a difference. What I get out of reading Marx and what all these other people got doesn't always work out the same. Those other people, between Marx and me, were shaped by different influences than shaped me. Not so surprising that I read the texts of Marx or Lenin or Luxemburg or up to the present, and I come out with something a little different. We had that experience, Steve Resnick and I, together as we worked through this literature. We were very lucky because we had gone to Ivy League schools in this country. I had gone to Harvard and Yale and all of that. Steve had gone to Pennsylvania and MIT. We got the benefit of those reputations. America is a very hierarchical, very elitist, very intimidated by prestige, and that worked for us. So we got jobs being professors that other people wouldn't get because of our pedigree, and that gave us the time and the leisure and the space and the secure income to do this work. I don't want to minimize that at all. The material conditions for us to do to have the answers to the questions you're posing were crucial to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here right now. All right, here's what we discovered. The basic shorthand that an awful lot of Marxists, including many who taught us, had come to use were a problem. And here's the example. The issue in capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production. Whoa. This didn't work for us. That's not, by the way, does Marx have lines like that? Yes. We're not questioning that people who had read Marx honestly and sincerely understood that. We could see how that would be. Absolutely. We could see how the very fact, for example, that Marx starts Capital by talking about commodities and exchange may be understood to say that for Marx, markets are the crucial institutions where he starts. It's what he talks about in the first few chapters. And if you read the correspondence between Marx and Engels, it's full of laments by Marx to Engels. How hard it is to start this book. How hard it is for him to decide how best to get into the material. He spent a lot of time crafting the whole structure as well as every word in those early chapters of volume 1 of Capital. But what Marx was doing there, he had to summarize. I couldn't go back and repeat it. So he developed certain phrases. Theorists do this all the time, that were for him nice, neat summaries. And ownership of the means of production was one of them. But for Steve and me, the more we studied, we came to a different conclusion. And here's how it works. Marx starts with the commodity and exchange and markets, not because that's the most important part of the story he has to tell. No. Not because it's the most important part of the capitalist economic system. Even more. No. He starts there because he's writing a book on economics in the middle of the 19th century, and that's what people think economics is about. It's the bourgeois mentality, the received wisdom of what this capitalist system is, that celebrates markets the way Adam Smith did, the way Ricardo did. But Marx picks out of Smith and Ricardo the moments when they seem to be interested in something else. And like we do to Marx, Marx did to them. He said, I'm more interested in for them, secondary, not what's primary. I'm going to start with commodities and exchange because that's what people think I ought to have in the forefront of my mind. That's why they'll pick up this book, and that's why they'll read far enough. But by chapters 4, 5, and 6, he's already taking them from the world of exchange to what he wants them to focus on, what is for him the more important thing, namely surplus. And then he goes and teaches us how the surplus happens not in exchange and markets. It happens somewhere else, in the workplace, long before the goods that are produced get sold, and after the goods that are purchased, the inputs, have been bought. Between the buying of the input and the selling of the output, there is the production. And right in there, in that relationship of production, in the relationship of employer and employee, that's where we want to focus. That's what we learned from Marx. But we live in a different time when an awful lot of people have absorbed the language of it's a question of the ownership of things, property. We have to we have to do a different task. We're talking to an audience that's already sympathetic to Marxism, but entranced by ideas which, in our judgment, distract them from the core issue. The issue isn't exchange. So we're not Marxists because we would like the workers to get a bigger wage. We want a higher minimum wage in our country. We want to uh, limit the profits a capitalist can get. None of that, because that doesn't understand the human relationship that Marx is at pains to expose in production. So we decide we're not going through commodity. We're not following Marx's method. We live at a different time, different in part because of what Marx has taught, valuable material he has taught, but we're going to go the next possible step, the step Marx's work paved the way to enable us to do, which is to say, friends and neighbors, readers and friends, here it is. We have figured out how to talk about exchange as Marx lays it out in such a way that we're not fighting with neoclassical economists or Keynesians about market relationships. We're able to immediately go somewhere they can't go. When you begin a bourgeois economics course, you learn about indifference curves. You learn about buying and selling and what motivates it. And there is no surplus. Many textbooks in conventional economics, if you go to the index, you look up surplus, it's not there. And if you do find it, it's about a consumer, an odd thing in which consumers are able to buy something which is not quite the money representative of the amount of utility they get from consuming it. A completely different idea than the very material notion of an excess of value produced by the worker and grabbed by the employer. So we put that front and center. The irony is, half of the Marxian tradition doesn't even get to that, is not aware of it at all. I used to bemoan, and I say this to you honestly, I used to bemoan the young people who came to us as teachers. having had exposure to Marxism, but they had read volume one of Capital. In volume one, Marx spends a lot of time showing you where the surplus is, making sure you get it. Not about exchange, about that surplus and what governs it, and why the length of the working day is all about that surplus once you know how to ask the question. But in volumes two and three, he then shows you how the surplus is distributed all over the place in capitalism, shaping many of the institutions in very profound ways. Banks, commercial executions, stores, all of that, joint stock companies, because Marx, he lived at a time when he knew about these things. And so you learn how to connect the production and distribution of surplus as the core issue to all the rest of the economy, which is what people don't get if they don't get taught that volume one tells you where the surplus is and how it arises, and volumes two and three tell you how it moves around and shapes everything in capitalism. And therefore, it's a recipe book for tracing how and why the production and distribution of surplus, or what I call class, matters.
Wow. So, in other words, and I've always had this question myself, and other people have also had this. I mean, for those of you who haven't already read this amazing book, Knowledge and Class, uh, I think that anyone who's serious about thinking about Marxism today should definitely read that book very, very carefully. It's compulsory text in many, many parts of the world, in many, many departments that are seriously thinking about a critical kind of political economy. Um, Rick said something really interesting in episode one, and you kind of alluded to it right now as well, which is that not only were you and Steve and the people in ASA who were working with you, not only were you guys interested in criticizing and developing a critique of bourgeois economics or capitalism, um, you were also developing a critique of Marxism as well, right? And you guys even founded this journal, which is now one of the most prominent journals in Marxist thought. It's called Rethinking Marxism. So clearly, as the title suggests, you guys were rethinking Marxism. You made it absolutely clear. But I want to push you a little further on the following question, because this is something that has befuddled many people around the world who use this broad category called the left, right? Or within economics, this broad category, this potpourri of ideas which are uh, non neoclassical, that were called heterodox economics, which evokes all kinds of weird, uh, ideas. I want you to distinguish, because you've spent a lot of time distinguishing your theory from the mainstream or the neoclassical theory. But in this book, Contending Economic Theories, because in the next episode, and I'm running out of time, we have 10 more minutes, and then we're going to be diving into, in our next episode, France, Germany, etc., because this is going to be applicative, guys, huh? Um, my question deals with the differences between Marxists and Keynesians in particular. Because many people on the right as well as the left think that, and they're good-hearted people, they have good intentions at play here, but since they don't understand this surplus idea that you've been kind of hammering again and again and again for multiple decades, um, many of our friends who used to call themselves Keynesians or post-Keynesians, etc., and we could have lovely conversations with them, but in their models, quote unquote, which I know you're a critic of, wage labor was assumed to be a given. The equation said that we're going to look at the profit to wage ratio and blah, blah, blah. I was waiting for the time where they're going to say, and this is when we're going to be abolishing wage labor. That moment never really occurred. Um, so for the audiences, the reform and the revolution, or the series of policies, ideas that you guys have been thinking about, and your this institution, Democracy at Work, kind of is propagating that particular solution to our issues of contemporary capitalism. Could you just spend 5 to 10 minutes distinguishing yourself and your ideas from Keynesian theory, or this idea that we could reform, redistribute via taxes? Because you see, every single time this is a policy debate. I mean, I live in central Pennsylvania, right? As you can imagine, when I say that, I'm neither a Keynesian, I'm a Marxist economist, they think that that means that, well, more taxes, blah, blah, blah. They assume automatically that that's what I'm saying. So, could you help me distinguish your idea and your program, your vision, from those who call themselves Keynesians or post Keynesians?
Yeah, this is a very important topic, and I mean, I'll do the best I can in a short amount of time, but we might want to think about revisiting it at some time to talk in greater length. Um, here's what I would say to you. John Maynard Keynes was a great economist. I learned a lot from reading his work. I therefore am very respectful of the work that he did. I thought he exposed flaws and weaknesses in the conventions of economics of his time, and that his lessons have only half been learned. What happened to Marx also happened to him, that the people who didn't like to hear what he had to say, namely, in my view, that capitalism without government intervention is its own worst enemy, will destroy itself, has within itself, if I can use Marxist language to interpret Keynes, has within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And that part of what Keynes did was show you what those seeds are, how they might work together in such a way to bring the system to a collapse. And remember, he wrote in the middle of the greatest collapse that capitalism has ever had, the 1930s depression, when he wrote the general theory. But his goal was not to go beyond capitalism. He sneered at communism. He rejected it explicitly and repeatedly. He was not interested in going beyond capitalism, never talked like that. What he was concerned with, though, was how capitalism worked. And he thought he had found the reasons it could break down into a terrible depression of the sort that he was living through and writing in. And that had to do with government intervention through the government's budget, taxing and spending on the one hand, and through the government's control necessarily of the money supply, at least in part through central banking, interest rate manipulation, quantity of money, and so on. And he laid all that out and taught the generation of capitalists today why they must use the government much more than they thought, forever splitting the capitalist class intellectually as well as in practice between those who are afraid that while they need the government, giving the government the power it needs to do what Keynes said compromises them in terms of the political control they have to operate in order to save themselves. That the conservatives, that's it. They accept government intervention, but they want to limit it, control it, constrain it, because they know where it can go. It can lead to the people being able to say, we have enough of capitalism, we're moving on, versus those who say you can't have that luxury. If you don't let the government come in a massive way, you will destroy the system you're pretending to save. But for me as a Marxist, all of this is a debate within capitalism about capitalism, how to save and serve capitalism, how to make it better. Of course, you can make it better. Capitalisms come in an endless variety of shapes and forms. In France, for example, when you finish high school and college, you take your first job. It is the law that the employer must give you 5 weeks of paid vacation every year. In the United States, you're not required to give your employee any paid vacation ever. And 5 weeks is something very few ever will see. So that's a big difference, and there are many more. But what's absent from Keynesian economics is any interest in and any theory of an alternative arrangement. He's not upset about the employer employee relationship, he takes it for granted. Marx's whole life, in my judgment, Das Kapital, is about how the employer exploits the employee. Look at the choice of words. He appropriates the service. He's taking something, the way Marx explains it, and using it to reproduce the system and giving it its qualities of inequality between rich and poor, giving this system the very instability cycles that Marx explains in a very different way as coming out of. Keynes is not interested in that. He's interested in categories, aggregate categories of investment and saving. He's not interested in the relationship of production between employer and employee, let alone transforming it. That's Marx's agenda, not Keynes's. So it's really misunderstanding, which happens in economics classes where you're taught here's the neoclassical model, here's the Keynesian model, and then some people who just don't get it think, oh, Marx is another model. No, it isn't. It's a whole different way of understanding the process. And I haven't even gone into the way in the Marxian system you have to study history. You have to always be aware that everything in the economic relationship is affected by, shaped by, influenced, literally constituted by politics and culture. You don't have that in bourgeois economics. The whole idea that you could have an economics discussion without politics and culture is nuts in the Marxian tradition. You can you isolate the economics? Yes, for the moment you can isolate it, so long as you remember you've just done that. You can't explain anything with your isolated bit of reality. You have to reinsert that isolation you've given to economics into the larger social to understand how anything actually happens, which of course people don't know how to do if they've gone through a curriculum where economics is over here with a disciplinary wall that you don't do psychology or history. And the joke is on economics is that if you start a bourgeois economics course, the first thing you learn is about exchange. And the first thing in exchange you learn is why people buy things. Yeah, but that's a psychological issue. You don't buy just because you're hungry. You buy in a particular way, a particular object to satisfy a particular interest, all of which are shaped by the society in which you live. Economics has to confront what it isn't because that's part of what it is. Aha, Hegel again. Economics has to understand that whatever it studies, defined however it does, has a boundary on the other side of which are all the other things that aren't economics, but that influence the economics. And if you don't study them, you're not going to get it about the economics either. This, this understanding that the non economic is part of the economic, different from it, but part of it, not the same, yet intrinsic to it, that you need Hegel for. And I don't mean Hegel for 10 years, I mean Hegel for 10 minutes to make it part of your mental capability to think like that so you can use it to understand.
Wow, wow. In other words, what Rick Wolf, Steve Resnick, and people who have been working with rethinking Marxism and trying to rethink Marxism are saying is that as long as there is a crisis of imagination, both within the left and on the right, we're going to be thinking about the problem in the wrong way. For example, when confronted with the issue of inflation, The only thing that the Fed could come up with is raise the interest rate, which was going to destroy the lives of working people in other ways, and there's no evidence to suggest that it worked in any case. Ecology, there's a catastrophe on the ecological scale. Carbon taxes. I mean, think about it. What Rick Wolf and Steve Resnick's work has demonstrated to us is that when you define things in a particular way, you restrict their meaning. Right? To define is to restrict in a certain sense.
Yep.
So if you define capitalism in terms of property relations, its opposite, i.e., socialism, is going to be what? Nationalize, socialize, blah, blah, blah. If you define it in terms of inequality, income, blah, 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 someone has a lot of money, etc. Our version of Marxian political economy is premised on, to reiterate, the surplus. Who makes it, who appropriates it, and who gets distributions out of it. All right, guys, I've run out of time, unfortunately, but in the next episode, I'm going to return and ask Professor Wolf the following question. If indeed it is the case that there is an alternative, that Tina is wrong and we must, throw it back into the dustbin of the lack of imagination and defeatism that it brings. If indeed it is the case that there is an alternative, what is happening in France, Germany, the United States, Great Britain right now? And what is the relative success and failure of the left? And what can we, as Marxists who want to change the world, learn from all of these concrete political practices and experiments? All right, guys, I hope you got something out of it. I'll see you all in the next episode. Here's Shahram Azhar signing off from the Dialectic at Work. Please follow our work and our Twitter pages at Dialectic at Work and Democracy at Work. Take care, guys. I'll see you in the next episode.